This is the escape route taken by John Wilkes Booth after he assassinated President Abraham Lincoln on the 14th of April, 1865. From Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to Garrett's farm in Port Royal, Virginia, where Booth was captured and killed, took a total of 12 days and 65 miles. History teaches that Booth was shot and killed by Sergeant Boston Corbett here on the left and died 2 hours later on Richard Garrett's front porch. Let's trace the steps of Booth's escape by going back to the afternoon of April 14, 1865. Actor and Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth stopped at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to pick up his fan mail, where he learned that President Lincoln was to attend the play that night. Booth hurriedly gathered a group of other conspirators. In the past, they had tried on 2 other occasions to kidnap the president with the intentions of swapping him for Confederate prisoners. Their attempts never did work out as planned. But now time was of the essence. General Lee, only a few days earlier, had surrendered to Grant. Booth, along with others, decided that kidnapping the president was not feasible. The escape route had been planned in advance for months. This is Howard's livery stable, where Booth went to and rented the strongest and fastest horse they had. The night of the assassination, Booth tied his horse in the back alley of the theater. The building straight ahead is the rear entrance. This is an inside look at Ford's Theater. You can see the president's box. The president was sitting on the right. Next to him was his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. They had 2 guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Miss Clara Harris, whose dress was covered in blood after the assassination. At 10:15 p.m., Booth climbed these stairs to the president's box, finding the president unprotected. He used this .44 caliber Derringer to assassinate the president. Now this is a look from the president's box. Before Booth jumped to the stage, he stabbed Major Rathbone. It's believed that Booth might have caught his spur on the draperies as he jumped 12 feet to the stage, breaking his leg. He managed to get to his waiting horse, being helped by stagehand Joseph Burroughs, who was given the job by Ned Sprangler, who worked at the theater and was party to the conspiracy, and will later be arrested and hung. Booth struck Burroughs before mounting his horse. The only obstacle in his way was crossing the Naval Yard Bridge, guarded by Sergeant Silas Cobb, with orders not to let anyone cross after 9 p.m., and it was already 10:30. This is a distant photo of the bridge, and this is a closer look at what Booth saw as he rode up. Notice the soldier on the left and the other guard standing on the right. After interrogating Booth, he was allowed to cross. A few minutes later, Booth's co-conspirator, David Harrell, arrived at the bridge and was allowed to cross without incident. Harrell's job in the plot was to direct Lewis Powell to Secretary Seward's home and aid in his escape. Although Seward was seriously stabbed several times, he lived. David Harrell soon caught up with Booth as they were expecting each other. Just after midnight, they arrived here at Mary Surratt's Tavern and Boarding House, less than 1 mile from Ford's Theater. The Surratt family was known supporters of the Confederacy. It's believed that Booth's kidnapping plans was formed here, as it was considered a safe house for Confederate underground. They only stayed here a few minutes. Harrell went in to pick up supplies and weapons that had been pre-staged. Booth never dismounted because of his broke leg. Mary Surratt will be arrested for her part in the conspiracy and become the first woman executed in the United States. A few years later, President Johnson stated he didn't know how much Mary knew about the conspiracy. When asked if that was so, why he didn't pardon her. He said the nation was in no mood to show mercy. I would have had riots on my hands. After leaving Surratt's tavern, the two conspirators headed south and arrived here at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd around 4 a.m., 6 hours after the assassination and 15 miles south of Washington. As Harold beat on the door to awaken the doctor, Booth remained on his horse at the front gate. Dr. Mudd came to the door, but first looked through these windows from the parlor to see who it was before opening. It was believed that Mudd was a party to the conspiracy to kidnap the president, but he had no knowledge of the assassination. Mudd set Booth's leg and allowed the two to sleep there. Later, authorities will find this boot belonging to Booth in the bedroom of Dr. Mudd's. Inside was the initials J. Wilkes. Dr. Mudd was convicted of conspiracy, although most of the evidence was circumstantial. He escaped execution by one vote. He was sentenced to life in prison at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas in Florida. While there, the prison doctor died from a yellow fever epidemic. Dr. Mudd took over and stopped the spread, saving many lives. And in 1869, after serving 4 years, President Andrew Johnson pardoned Dr. Mudd. Now around 4 p.m. on the 15th, some 18 hours after the assassination, and before leaving Dr. Mudd's, Booth shaved his mustache. He headed to Rich Hill, the home of Confederate sympathizer Samuel Cox. On the way to Cox's home, some 18 miles south of Dr. Mudd's farm, the two entered the Ezekiel Swamp around 4:30 p.m., located just behind Mudd's house. The treacherous swamp was 1/2 mile wide and several miles long. The pair got lost and emerged 2 hours later, only a mile from Dr. Mudd's. They searched for a guide to take them through the swamp. Around 9 p.m. they arrived at the home of a free black man, Oswald Swan. He had no idea who the men were. Swan gave them bread and drink. They hired him to guide them to Colonel Samuel Cox's place, a well-known Confederate sympathizer. The three arrived at Colonel Cox's around 1 a.m. on the 16th. Cox allowed the two men to enter the house for a meal, but they couldn't stay there. It would endanger his family. Oswald Swan waited patiently outside until the two men came out to pay him the $20 they had promised him. Colonel Cox sent him to a pine thicket some 2 miles away to hide. He then had someone bring him supplies with intentions of helping him to cross the Potomac River. They would stay in the thicket 4 more days until the 21st. A friend of Colonel Cox's will lead the two fugitives to the Potomac River, furnish them a rowboat like the one you see, and compass so that they could reach the Virginia side. Again, the two get lost and find they had drifted north instead of crossing to Virginia. It'll be the 23rd before they actually reached Virginia. They had been using the disguise of being Confederate soldiers on their way home. But now word of President Lincoln's assassination was getting out and people were becoming more cautious. In the late afternoon of the 23rd, Booth and Harold arrived at this house, the home of Dr. Richard Stewart, expecting help. He refused to provide assistance, even medical assistance, and suggested they try the Lucas family across the field. This is the cabin of William Lucas, a free black family. When Booth and Harold arrived, Booth was so mad at not receiving help he had expected from Dr. Stewart, he evicted the Lucas family out of their own home by knife point. They spent the night inside the cabin. The next morning, on the 24th, they hired Charlie Lucas, William's son, to take them by wagon to Port Conway across the river from Port Royal, Virginia. They promised him $20. On the way, they met Confederate soldiers that promised to help them find a safe place to stay. Booth arrived at the farm of Richard Henry Garrett around 4 p.m. on the 24th, posing as a Confederate soldier on his way home, using the name Boyd. The Garretts welcomed him with open arms. The first night, Booth slept in the room with Garrett's sons. David Harold spent the night with the Confederate soldiers they had met the day before, and the next day, on April the 25th, David Harold joined Booth at Garrett's farm. The Garretts became somewhat suspicious when the two wanted to hide in the woods when a group of Union soldiers rode past. David Harold wanted to keep moving, but Booth insisted on spending another night. That night, the pair was refused lodging in the house, but was allowed to sleep in the nearby tobacco barn. Horses are very valuable at that time, and Mr. Garrett was afraid the two might steal his horses in the middle of the night, so he locked the barn door without Booth or Harold knowing. Union troops knew that the fugitives would most likely take the ferry across the river. They began interrogating a fisherman near the ferry, showing pictures of Booth and Harold. The fisherman said he believed one of the Confederate soldiers with Booth and Harold was staying at the Star Hotel in Bowling Green. Union soldiers dragged ex-private William Jett out of his bed by gunpoint. He led them to the Garrett farm. The Garretts said that they had seen the initials JWB on the forearm of the older man, but he told them he was James W. Boyd. Now, having your initials tattooed on your forearm had become fashionable for that time. At 2:30 a.m. on Wednesday, April the 26th, 1865, the 16th New York Cavalry surrounded the Garrett's tobacco barn. Luther Baker shouted for the men to come out. David Harold quickly gave up and come out of the barn. Both refused to surrender. He asked Harold not to tell about all these weapons that he had. These are the weapons found with Booth. Union soldiers set the barn on fire, hoping to force Booth to come out. In the meantime, soldier Boston Corbett fired a shot through the openings in the boards, striking Booth in the neck, paralyzing him. Booth was taken out of the barn and laid on the Garrett's front porch. He passed away a few hours later. His body was wrapped in a horse blanket, placed in a market wagon, to a steamship, to a government tugboat, and finally onto an ironclad, the USS Montauk, who took the body to the Washington Naval Yard, docked here on the right. Booth's body was stored at the Arsenal Penitentiary. In 1869, his remains was given to the family and was buried in the family plot at Greenmont Cemetery in Baltimore. John Wilkes Booth was 26 years old. This should have been the end of the story, but it's not. Over the years, stories persist that Booth escaped and spent the remainder of his life in Texas and later committed suicide at the Grand Avenue Hotel in Enid, Oklahoma. There's a small town in northeast Mississippi that insists John Wilkes Booth spent the rest of his life in Guntown, a small town 15 miles north of Tupelo, once called Campbelltown. The mayor was so convinced he placed a tombstone on a grave believing to be Booth's. Would it not be more feasible for a man on the run to go to kinfolk for help? Emily Eppin Pressey, the granddaughter of Dr. John Fletcher Booth, believed to have been cousins of John Wilkes Booth. Emily, who passed away in 1988, relayed the story told her by her mother. Around the time that the assassin of President Lincoln was captured and killed, a man with a limp shows up at Dr. Booth's home. The man moved into a room on the second floor. The kids knew him only as Uncle. They was told to never speak of him to anyone. Emily stated that it was her mother's job to take food to Unc, as they call him. He would only come down in the evenings when people were not staring. A friend of Dr. Booth's was plantation owner Colonel Robert Gordon, who was believed to have met John Wilkes Booth in Canada when several conspirators met to form plans to kidnap Lincoln. Colonel Gordon fought under General Jeb Stuart and General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Colonel Gordon was briefly suspended of his command for conspiring with John Wilkes Booth in the assassination of President Lincoln. Emily said that after Unc died, he was buried in an unmarked grave at the family plot in Smith Cemetery. When asked why Unc was never exhumed and DNA performed, they said no one had enough interest to do it. The family of John Wilkes Booth went to court to have his body exhumed. They wanted to be sure it was Booth in the family plot at Greenmont Cemetery in Baltimore. It'd be a simple DNA test to answer all questions. The family's attorney contended that John Wilkes Booth may not have been at the Garrett's barn, but it was someone else. Unfortunately, the Greenmont Cemetery opposed the exhumation. The Circuit Court in Baltimore, under Judge Joseph H. Kaplan, turned down the request by the Booth family to learn who was resting in the family plot. The mystery goes on.